Just as the Dominion looks to be on its last legs, the enigmatic Breen Confederacy joins their cause. But what exactly does this unknown power bring to the table? Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today, after quite a while, I've finally gotten around to covering Breen Fleet Doctrine. I know I made a video about 2 years ago now, actually analysing the Breen ship in an effort to understanding other Breen ships. We're finally going to get round to the actual Breen Fleet Doctrine during the Dominion War in depth. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So, first things first, I need to give a bit of context to the Breen. Because, of course, the Breen are a completely unknown race. We don't even know what they look like. They might be space wolves, not that kind of space wolf. We don't know what a Breen looks like. They come from a very treacherous area of space. They live very close to the Black Cluster, which is very, very dangerous indeed. And naturally, they've actually become quite gifted spacers over the years. They know how to fly a starship very well. Because they are surrounded by treacherous space, they've sort of been cut off from the rest of the galaxy, and thus they're relatively xenophobic, and they have a strong tradition of armed neutrality. They're also known for being privateers and mercenaries. This is mostly only known through Ferengi contacts. The Ferengi were one of the few species that were able to contact the Breen and, well, live to tell the tale. And that's really all we know about them. We know that they are interested in commerce, in privateers and in mercenary work, but that otherwise they're a pretty obscure small state. So, with that now understood, let's take a look at the design of Breen ships, because they are very unique compared to the other powers of the Alpha and Beta quadrants. First of all, Breen ships are actually modular in their design, to an extent. There's basically a few key components that are shared throughout the entire fleet, and you can basically just chop and change how you incorporate them onto your ships. And it's likely that this is something of a cost-cutting measure, rather than having individual bespoke components for each ship class. By having modular components, it makes it much easier for mass production. So perhaps while ships are not necessarily as high-tech as their counterparts, they're able to produce many more of them, and very quickly. So in terms of the actual components that we have, I'm just going to name them so that you know what they are. So we have blades. These are either engines or habitation modules, but that's the primary shape. It's basically the curved shape on a Breen ship. If it's got a glow on it, that means that it is an engine. If it doesn't, that means it's for habitation. We then have on the end of these blades prongs. These are the energy weapons. And then we also see mounted all across the hull pods. These contain the torpedo launchers, and larger pods also contain habitation areas. We then also have mounted ventrally a large deflector unit. This is often a discrete component rather than built into the center of the ship, which in itself is quite interesting. Before we break down individual Breen ship classes, I will just make a summary of observations. Breen ships are basically glass cannons. They are extremely slippery, extremely maneuverable. They are paper thin. They are not made for linear battle. And this makes sense given that the Breen don't really have a record of peer warfare. The Breen have mostly just been practicing piracy and privateering for most of their history, so they're not used to large conventional wars, especially not on the scale of the Dominion War. Now let's go into the individual ship classes, starting with the Pleshbrek class destroyer. At 270 meters long, this is a little bit larger than we would typically give for a destroyer, but given its relatively small inhabitable volume, it's probably still relatively commensurate with other destroyers. It has an interesting trifoil design with asymmetric blades. None of these blades are exactly the same, and this basically gives it what we would call a differential warp field. Essentially, one part of the warp field is stronger than the other. It's kind of similar to certain mononacelle designs or trinacelle designs. Basically, you have a dominant warp nacelle and then a secondary set of nacelles which are kind of used for steering. This means that it's actually highly manoeuvrable at warp speed. This trifoil design also means that the Blechbreck is actually a very difficult target to engage, because its mass is dispersed over quite a wide area. Now, in terms of its armament, the Blechbreck is armed with 3 prongs, one on each of the blades, and then 4 torpedo pods. However, just like its larger cousin, the Blechbreck is modular. So, while it's less frequently customized, it is still done. So there are a couple of different Blechbrecks that are out there. There's the tri-warp drive, otherwise known as the spinner. So this has 3 symmetrical warp nacelles. And when I say spinner, I mean spinner, as in generally when it's in warp flight, it will spin in order to impart greater acceleration. Now, of course, this does mean that generally it's actually performing more like an annular warp drive rather than a trinacelle design, but because of the way the various blades are positioned, they're able to imitate an annular warp field whilst also maintaining the benefits of a trinacelle design, i.e. the maneuverability. Annular warp drive can only send you in one direction and it's basically impossible to turn. With a trinacelle design, you can still get those benefits of the annular warp drive whilst also having a surprising degree of maneuverability. And then there is a mononacelle variant. This can simply be known as the cutter, and that is much more for territorial defense. Essentially, these various modifications are basically connected to how fast do you want your Blechbreck to go, and how much fuel do you want it to guzzle. Now, the Blechbreck, in terms of its combat performance, it can basically be summarized as extremely annoying, but also extremely fragile. It's quite large, quite substantial for a destroyer, and with some very powerful weapons, it's quite capable of picking off small attack ships at leisure. At the same time, it's far faster than any of the other destroyers that are out there, far more maneuverable than any other destroyer, and so it's very difficult to match destroyer with destroyer. And then it's even faster and more maneuverable than the larger frigates. So ultimately, it's very difficult to deal with without a lot of frustration and annoyance. But in terms of its actual threat, this thing is not going to be taking on the capital ships. This is not going to be threatening heavy cruisers. If any of them stay in a protracted engagement with a heavy cruiser or larger, they are just going to get smacked. But they are so agile and maneuverable that it's difficult for anyone to really deal with them. Going up, this brings us to the Chelgret frigate, or the Breen ship, as you would probably know it. This is the backbone of the Breen Fleet, and that's generally because it's a very good multi-role platform. Given that the Breen are known for having a tradition of working as privateers, they like to have ships that are decently sized, but quite agile and very flexible, and the Chelgret provides them that. It is 330 meters long, so sits very neatly in that frigate range, alongside ships like the Intrepid and New Orleans, although again, far less durable and far more agile. They are extremely modular, so it has 1 heavy prong and 2 light prongs. That heavy prong is just basically some extended range, but it can do some severe damage. It certainly is more powerful than the light prongs, and it has 6 torpedo pods, so that's only 2 more than the Blechbreck. What sets it apart from the smaller Blechbreck is that the Chelgret has the ability to carry the energy dampening weapon, and this is incredibly dangerous because most powers of the time do not yet have a counter to that particular weapon. It's their mainline frigate. These are extremely agile for their size. They are the backbone of the Breen Fleet, and there are a couple of variants as well. We have the Crab variant, which, strangely enough, is actually designed for pursuit. Instead of having 1 major blade, it has 4 smaller blades, all of which are warp nacelles. So effectively, it's a quad nacelle design. So this is designed to go out in pursuit of enemy vessels. While it does partially sacrifice a lot of firepower in order to do this, it very much gives the Breen an ability to further screen their movements, which is really quite important when you can't stand up to a sustained fight. And then we have the Lancer variant. This does the exact opposite and adds 2 major blades together, effectively forming one super heavy prong on the end. This is basically the closest equivalent the Breen have to a monitor. It's not known whether this variant existed before the Dominion War or was actually a result of lessons learned from watching the other powers of the Dominion War, who all made frequent use of monitors. Again, it's got a similar kind of performance to other Breen ships in relation to its counterparts. While extremely maneuverable and agile, it is extremely fragile, and its firepower is still not quite up to the par of most of the other monitors of the time. But unlike other monitors which often find themselves having to sit back, this monitor is perfectly capable of being extremely aggressive and following the formation in, a little bit like the Klingon Kron class will. And I will just finish off this summary of the Chelgret by saying that it is without a doubt the fastest frigate of the war, at least at sublight. So we've now covered the backbone of the Breen fleet, but the Breen, surprisingly enough, still have a few more tricks up their sleeve. Very large tricks. This brings us to the Sar Theln class heavy cruiser. This is 530 meters long. So it has 2 minor prongs, 1 major, so actually less prongs than the Chelgret, but 7 torpedo pods, which is only 1 more than the Chelgret. It also features a energy damper and a heavy tractor beam, and it is speculated that this is actually salvaged from a Borg ship. This is the Breen's heavy cruiser, and as you can see, at 530 meters long, it is very large, and actually quite different from other Breen ships. It's a much more conventional design, it's much more linear in its construction, and it does actually break the mold in other ways as well. Compared to other Breen ships, it's a lot more durable. It's still very fast, it's got a lot of engines. The only difference is that with this long shape, it's much harder to steer. So this ship tends to just kind of sail in on a direct line and just pummel whatever gets in its way. And it's relatively well equipped to do so, but it certainly can't do it unsupported. Again, it's still going to be weaker and fragile than most other heavy cruisers. What makes this ship particularly unique is that it carries boarding craft, which likely means that this ship in its original role was actually intended as a kind of internal policing vessel, basically to maintain order within the Breen Confederacy, by having a ship that is larger and meaner than most of your average Breen privateers. But it does also demonstrate a limitation of the Breen, that being that while this is in the heavy cruiser category, it is far below the capabilities of other heavy cruisers of the time period, and it certainly isn't up to par with most of them. But its main role in the Dominion War is serving as a command cruiser. It does have a few tricks up its sleeve. With that tractor beam in particular, it is able to basically hold enemy ships in place and drain their shields and pummel them, and critically make life easier for smaller, more maneuverable Breen ships. And it's likely that the Breen were hoping during the war to set these loose behind enemy lines and use them as commerce raiders, and in that role they would have done very well. But in linear battle, they very much are wanting. While they're large, they're not strong enough to really justify their size, and often are just considered oversized targets. This brings us to, last but not least, the Sar Theln carrier. This is of no real relation to the Sar Theln cruiser, it's probably just a linguistic coincidence. This is a very different ship. It's very lightly armed, it only carries 2 torpedo pods, but they are perhaps extended for long-range fire, and it carries 1 major and 1 minor prong. This is a very limited loadout, and that is because its primary role is in carrying fighters, and it carries 40 Belth Choas attack fighters in the hangar blade. It's able to launch 2 waves of 20 ships. In a 2-ship formation, which is the normal deployment of these carriers, that means that you're looking at about 40 to 80 fighters, depending whether or not they want to attack all at once or perform a series of attacks. That aside, there's not really much to it, so I think we better go and take a look at the fighters that they are carrying. These are the Belth Choas fighters. They are two-man fighters. They are about 20 meters long, and they are basically, while they can be described as fighters, they are better described as dive bombers or attack bombers. They have one weapon, which is a micro-torpedo pod on the end of one of the blades. It may also have some energy weapons, but they'll be very limited and certainly not up to par with other fighters of the time, which carry actually very powerful energy weapons. So with these limited defenses, it is not for countering enemy fighters. The Breen never fought other fighters. These are used largely as ground attack craft, and in that role they are excellent. They are numerous and they are extremely fast, and they can sow a lot of confusion and devastation, particularly against unfortified targets. While the Belchas does lack the firepower to break heavy fortifications on almost anything else, which is generally what Breen privateers were going after anyway, it is perfectly adequate. And it would also do reasonably well when it comes to swarming enemy capital ships, and would actually probably do a reasonably good job of evading enemy attack ships which could be sent to take them out. While a Cardassian Hideki is relatively capable of chasing off peregrine fighters, I doubt it would be capable of chasing off these. These are much smaller and even more maneuverable than the small peregrine fighters. Finally, we'll talk about formations. These are much more irregular compared to what we've seen from the other powers so far. The basic formation is that of a star. This is 5 ships strong, generally made up of the same ship, or at least 4 of the same ship, and then a leader. Generally with destroyers, that'll be a frigate leader, then with a frigate, it'll be a cruiser leader, so on and so forth, up and up we go. But that is a formation that gives you a lot of flexibility. You can mix and match different kinds of frigate among each other. So a very common star when it comes to frigates is 2 crabs, 2 regulars, and then 1 lancer. Then we have the cluster. This is 4 stars put together, and this gives us 20 ships. This is equivalent to a brigade, and much like a brigade, these are sort of independent units that still have their own kind of specialization. So you'll have a cluster of destroyers, a cluster of frigates. You can, again, mix and match as you like, pretty much. Breen Fleet Doctrine is very sort of open in that respect, so it's very easy to just customize a cluster for whatever it is you need. But they are basically small, independent forces still specialized towards a particular kind of attack. And then finally, you have the fleet. This is at least 5 clusters, and this design of fleet, while similar in size to other nations, is still actually quite modest. This design very much favours mobility, and it speaks to a semi-irregular fleet design that the Breen have. Again, the Breen have not been fighting the other major powers of the Alpha and Beta Quadrant like the Klingons, Federation and Romulans have, all of whom have been fighting each other or in cold war with one another for centuries. The Breen have very much developed in isolation, and as a result, the same rules don't apply to them, and this is why they have a much more irregular and mobility-focused doctrine. Klingon doctrine does emphasize mobility, but it is critically mobility paired with aggression. The Breen don't necessarily share that idea. The Breen are far less interested in aggression and more into continued survival. They've never really had to defend their territory all that often, and so a lot of their thinking is based on being more aggressive, but also having the liberty of choosing their battles. They don't often have to stand their ground and defend to the last man, because generally they're not fighting for their own territory, they're fighting for someone else, and if it really does look like the battle's going to go against them, well, what does any good mercenary do? Find your payday somewhere else. So, just to wrap up, the Breen do bring something unique to the Dominion Alliance, and to the war as a whole. If we look at the Dominion, we have basically 2 contradictory sets of ideas. We have the fluidic warfare of the Dominion, the rigid linear warfare promoted by the Cardassians. The Breen brings something completely different, which is irregular warfare. they've got actually quite a similar level of structure and sophistication to their formations as the Cardassians do, whilst also deploying them in a fashion that is very, very similar to that of the Dominion. So you might say that they are a bit of a halfway house, but that belies the real unique position of the Breen. It is fair to say that while they are a bit of an in-between, they are also an extreme. Their ships are even more extremely specialised than the Cardassians, and their tactics are even more fluidic than that of the Dominion. So, while it can be said that they are a hybrid of the two systems, it operates very much on the extremes of those ideas. And it's interesting to point out that actually the Breen's use of irregular tactics does seem to have an influence on Starfleet. The idea of the aggressive reconnaissance formation only really gained ground in Starfleet in the later months of the war after the Breen had joined and shown the benefits of such a aggressive and irregular approach to warfare. Rather than planning out offensives necessarily, the idea was to be a lot more spontaneous and take opportunities as they arose before anyone even realised what was happening. But it remains to be seen if they can handle a heavyweight fight. And other lesser powers in the Alpha and Beta quadrants will be watching with great interest. Doubtless, the Breen's performance in the war will have considerable influence on the post-war world. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Sorry that it took me 2 years to do this.